So I think one of the like major worries in like Christians that are like say like not inclined to believe in evolution will also bring this up along with like atheists is when you think about like the evolutionary story of how we get to like September 16th, 2021, where we're talking here involves like hundreds of millions of years of like animal suffering and death and starvation and predation, all these terrible things. And someone might wonder, like, how can we make sense of like a good God, like using a process that seems like pretty horrific like this? So not an easy question, Zach. So I'll just let you have fun.
Yeah. So this is the hard one, I guess. But some similar considerations as what we were thinking about before regarding history also going to be relevant. Like history is also messy. Sorry, and yeah, so there's a lot of messiness and apparent purposelessness in history. And you could say, well, how is God in charge of this historical process? But then there are other things where you can see things that a Christian would say are clear evidences of God's involvement in history. So maybe there's something like this in evolution. Maybe there's a lot of messy stuff. It's really hard to understand. We don't understand it all, but there could still be clear hints of purposefulness through that process. So that's basically how I would see it. That I'm not claiming to have kind of a perfect theodicy that solves all of these difficult questions, but there are still these strong hints, and I think taken together, they are quite powerful. Maybe also the evidence of suffering and apparent purposelessness, maybe that's also powerful. Maybe they kind of balance each other out. I would be okay with it, actually, because there's a bunch of arguments for theism. So if people are willing to trade off, the argument from design and the argument from evil or suffering, I'd be happy to make that trade as a theist, given the kind of the other things we have. So even if you're really, I would say, even if you're pretty pessimistic about it, and you think it's an even trade, that actually still leaves the theist in a pretty good position, given the other arguments like a moral argument, cosmological argument, and such. So I'm happy to see it even as evidence against theism, given that there's a bunch of stuff stacking up on the other side. And this is at least how a lot of science works. That science is never really perfect and precise. There's always some experiments that don't quite fit, or some things that are not quite fully explained by a theory. Often this is kind of like, it's taught in like a really simplistic way, as if there's only one possible truth that could have been come up with, and it's also obvious and clear. But in reality, science is always messy, and there's always kind of data that we're still trying to incorporate, particularly in biology, which is super messy. That there's always the stuff that we don't understand yet that's difficult to fit in. This is true with any theory of the world. I think it's also true with worldviews, that things are always messy and not perfect.
No, keep going. I thought you were finished. Yeah.
Yes. So that's part of it. Another thing is just the whole way that people see evolution. A whole other massive conversation to have is, should we emphasize, the death and randomness aspect of evolution? And I think a lot of people just overdo that. That there's also a lot of cooperation in evolution. There's a lot of things that seem more positive. So you can look at it from different perspectives and see different things. So there's a guy, Martin Novak, leading evolutionary theorist, who co-wrote a book with Sarah Coakley, who's a leading theologian, and they've written about this topic of cooperation in evolution, and how that maybe is more friendly from a theological perspective, and is a really important thought or aspect of modern evolutionary theory, is really exploring how cooperation is super important. So this idea that it's all about death and competition and suffering is missing out on a lot of what evolution actually is, and maybe it's emphasizing the wrong parts of it. So yeah, that's a whole other angle that I would take in addressing that question.
Yeah, no, I really like that. And like, I think it's part of like Swinburne. I was reading his book on the problem with you a little bit ago, and he talked about like animal suffering. He said something pretty similar with regards like, well, like, yeah, there's evils and the animals face them. They also have the chance to do good things like cooperate or like take care of each other or things like that. And the idea of a trade-off is super helpful too. Cause like like I think we'd both be willing to say, like, yeah, certain like things with like maybe like evolution or like suffering, like these are potentially not what you'd expect if God exists. But then you have this question of like, what explains this whole structure that allows for evolution in the first place? And you look at, like we just talked about, like potential things, even just in like evolutionary theory itself, that may point towards design, nonetheless, like everything else. And like it seems like we can make these trade-offs, which is something I really like, because that's probably the right way to think. I think sometimes, like I heard a Christian the other day say, like, there is nothing that atheism can explain better than Christianity. And I'm like, well, I mean, I don't know. Like thinking about like animal suffering and stuff, I'm like, yeah, potentially there's these things here, but like when you look at the trade-offs, like, you know, we follow evidence as it balances out.
Yeah, and I think that is an interesting point that could be explored further regarding suffering. That in order to have this suffering, you need to have evolution in the first place. So if there is any kind of like design argument, whether it's from, even if it's fine tuning, fitness of the environment, or the more specific stuff that I was kind of hinting at regarding the genetic code, convergence, and other things we could explore. If any of these things work, then that's like a prerequisite before you can have the suffering. So they need to be kind of traded off in some way. You can't think of them as, they're not fully independent. So I think that helps, at least, that it seems to me at least that the whole framework of the world is just much better explained with an atheistic view. Even if there are parts of it that are still really confusing and don't seem to fit so well, kind of stepping back from the whole framework, the contingency of the world, the law-likeness of the world, the beauty of the world, as well as the moral aspects and all the fine-tuning stuff together is just a really powerful case, I think. And I'm happy to do some of the trade-offs.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of theists that I've seen do this. Like one is, I think it's Josh Rasmussen, and there's others who they'll approach these arguments from like evil with this, like, you know, like if you put it like a Bayesian form, like the probability of suffering on atheism is high and on theism it's low, so like it favors atheism over theism. I've seen a lot of theists jump the gun and say, well, like, what about atheism predicts that there'd be like a high probability of suffering? Like you're assuming, like in this kind of like at least a standard form of the argument from evil, that there is this mechanism which allows for conscious life to develop over time, which is able to suffer, which is like completely unexpected, I think, given atheism. If you think about like what does it actually like predict or entail, and it's like we don't really know. Whereas in theism, like we potentially have the resources to explain some of it, which is why some actually think that suffering actually favors theism over atheism. So yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot more work to do in kind of really fitting these things together and not treating them so independently, because they do, they're really integrated. And if you do need a fine-tuned universe in order to have suffering, that's really interesting. That raises really interesting questions, I think.
Yeah, taking it holistically is definitely a good move. So do you have anything else you want to say with regards to like the problem of evil or anything like that, Zach, before we move on?
I mean, there's probably heaps to say, but I think so the main thing I'd usually say is that often the case is kind of like distorted, or like the focus is really just on the death and competition. But scientifically, and just in modern evolutionary theory, there's a lot more than that. So that's just important. Like when we're looking at what is the data that we're trying to explain, we should try and explain actual modern evolutionary theory, not just the bits that atheists like to focus on. That's probably the main thing that I would say.
That's good.
Yeah, but there's obviously lots of theodicy kind of related things that should also be explored.
Yeah, I remember talking with Joshua Swamidas about like a similar question and like the lots of death, and he just kind of came back on it. I was like, yeah, well, there's also lots of life, and I was like, yeah, I guess I didn't really think about it that way before. So yeah, that's good.